I'd like to start by thanking you for being here. As Sokuzan often does, just let you know that we really appreciate all the support you show through your contributions and your participation. There's a great deal, and I mean a great deal, that goes into keeping this functioning, operating up and running, just being able to continue to make these teachings available, let alone the maintenance of the building. So anything you can offer is always greatly received and appreciated. And again, if nothing else, your greatest gift is your participation in these teachings and practices.
Thank you for joining Basic Buddhist Teachings this evening. Kind of great play, a pretty simple topic to talk about tonight in some sense, and that is just the early life of the Buddha. And I think sometimes we take for granted that story. Maybe you don't know it, so if you don't, it's kind of a nice story. But in reading about it, something inevitably we have to acknowledge is that there's so little way to validate or verify the historical accuracy of any of this. What scholars do agree on is somebody named Siddhartha Gautama lived, and it was somewhere between 900 and 800 BCE, likely born around Lumbini, which is in Nepal. What I thought was interesting too is just the number of conflicting stories, not conflicting, but just different iterations of how the Buddha has been presented over time, whether it's being the presentation through the lens of the Theravadan tradition or the Mahayana or the Vajrayana tradition, or if it's being presented in a cultural or a scholastic context. And one of the interesting things that I came across was that in the 19th century, the Buddha was highly whitewashed in a sense of they wanted to make him seem like a very rational Western Socratic philosopher. And so they took out all the wonderful magical aspects that we may recognize from hearing the story in a Buddhist context. And so how the politics of the time, and I don't mean like governmental politics, but just the dominant thought of the time filters and determines how something is represented. So after 2,500 years, there's a lot of stories about the Buddha. But the first story I heard about the Buddha is a pretty traditional one and somewhat of a magical one, that the Buddha's mother, so his mother Mahamaya, is that his mother? Or was that his aunt? Anybody? Nobody knows. But his mother, on the night he was conceived, had a dream where the six-tusked white elephant entered into her body. And in some accounts, very similar to Christ, we have a virgin conception. We have a woman who conceives of a child that was put into her belly, into her womb. And then it's said that when the Buddha was born, he took several steps and spoke and said, "This will be my last birth." So magical, wonderful. But it is said that his father was a ruler at the time. Maybe he was just a high-level merchant, or maybe he had some say-so over the kingdom, but he was an aristocrat. And so he brought in a number of Brahmins to make some prediction about who this young prince would be, this young boy would be. And there was a near consensus that he would either become what's called a Chakravartin, a great world ruler, a political ruler, someone who would bring peace and harmony and rule with kindness and justice, or that he would become a great religious leader and become a Buddha who would awaken. And so his father, having a strong preference that he assume responsibility of the kingdom, kept Siddhartha cloistered, heavily cloistered on his compound, and actually even kept him from learning about religion. The Buddha did not have, in some stories, a formal education about religion because it would acknowledge death and suffering. So the Buddha was given food and toys, and he got older, women and music and everything to satiate his senses. But one of his early experiences was a natural or instant dhyana state or meditative state he experienced while sitting under a tree on his father's property. And that'll come up later. But over time, he married to Yasodhara and had a son named Rahula. And at one point, he was able to take his first ride outside of the compound on a chariot. And it's said that he confronted what we often call the four signs or the four marks of existence. And the first one was sickness, that he had been able to not ever see sickness in his life. And that confused him to see a body that was struggling or frail or unwell. And he asked the charioteer, he said, yes, all people get sick. And so he's like, I don't know, what's that about? And he goes out again, and then it said the next sign or the next mark was old age, which is interesting to me that somehow his father was able to keep all the old people away. Never seen an old body wrinkling and starting to hunch over and graying. And he again asked the charioteer, what's that? Well, everyone gets old. And on his next trip out, he saw death. He saw a decaying corpse in the street. What's that? Well, everyone dies. So quite distraught at this point. And on his last trip out, it said that he saw a mendicant or a holy person. A mendicant literally means someone who subsists off of alms. They beg for their well-being, a mendicant. And this last sign is called peace sometimes. And so the Buddha had all of this despair of sickness, old age, and death. And then finally saw some glimmer that maybe there doesn't have to be this suffering. A mendicant. I want to add one point onto these four marks, and that is something that's also sometimes acknowledged, although not in this story, which is birth. There's a dedication from I received from SokukoJi, and the third line says, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara may I free all being. So from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. So to acknowledge right from the beginning, at birth, it's not morbid, it's not anything other than when our son, essentially my son, Rumi, was born, you hold this child and it showed up to me that this child is going to suffer so much in his life. Maybe not famine and warfare, or maybe not abuse and murder, but if this child lives to old age, right from birth, he will begin to experience suffering. His first suffering was being C-sectioned out of Senchu's womb. And now it's cold, and it's bright, and it's loud. And then they start poking his heel with a needle, take his blood. So birth, old age, sickness, and death, and peace. So at this point that the Buddha went back to his parents and said, I'm leaving. Here's all of my silk, all of my brocade. I'm sorry, Yasodhara. I'm sorry, Rahula. I can't live in a world knowing that this type of suffering is out there. And so he began his own spiritual path as a mendicant. And it had several evolutions. So we start with extreme indulgence, like the epitome of luxury. But on seeing those marks, he realized a dead body can't eat this sweet fruit. A dead body can't enjoy this music. An old body may not be able to enjoy all of this sex. And so the first two stages he went through were with Brahmin teachers. And it is said that very quickly he attained the highest levels of meditation that the first one taught. And his teacher said, you are my equal, travel the country with me as my equal and teach this. And the Buddha thought, but I've not ended suffering. Like, yes, I've attained these profound, deep states of meditation. And then the same thing happened with his second teacher, these deep, very manipulative forms of meditation about mind control. You just shut out everything, no thoughts, no anything. And the teacher said, "You've attained my way. Let's go and teach." And Buddha said, "I can't." So his next attempt was, well, my early life was indulgence, everything I could want, every sense pleasure there is. Maybe the other direction is the way to go, extreme asceticism. And at this time, a lot of holy people's merit or fame was based on the degree of asceticism they practiced, how extreme they could be in the self-mortification. And so sometimes we see these images of the Buddha completely emaciated. It's almost like you can see his spine through his belly. His ribs are showing, his face is all gaunt. And he's practicing things like pranayama, breaths to like slow the heart down. And some of the stories say at one point he was only eating 1 grain of rice a day. And so he did this for quite some time, thinking that the body is the problem, that our problem is the body. If we can just transcend the body, no suffering. But similarly, no result. He wasn't able to really do anything. Maybe again, interesting states of mind. So at this point, it's said that he took in a glass of milk and some rice pudding, and everyone that was following him left. Siddhartha's given up. Siddhartha's left a holy path. He's gone back into his cushy life of drinking a glass of milk and rice pudding. And the Buddha had that memory of sitting under the tree on his father's property and remembered that meditation. And so the story goes that he sat down under the Bodhi tree and he made a vow to himself that he would not get up until he had attained awakening. And so he sat under the tree, he meditated, and the story goes that he saw the 12 links in reverse, starting at sickness, old age, and death. And he worked that all the way back to the first link on the chain of existence, which is ignorance. And so he saw the dependent nature of everything. He saw that everything was without self nature. And so to him, that was the cessation of suffering, was to see that there is no sufferer. But the last thing he had to overcome is Mara, the tempter. And it said that Mara, this demonish, devilish figure, came down to kind of disrupt the Buddha and challenge him, and challenged him with one of his daughters trying to seduce him. Another daughter was trying to frighten him with armies of demons. And then the last one was trying to just undermine any authority. And that last gesture was, by what authority do you claim this realization? And this is where we see the Buddha just stick his fingers into the dirt, stick his fingers into the earth. And it's like the earth was the only confirmation he needed. Just sitting here. I'm just sitting here. And I don't think it is some meaningful ways in like, oh, the earth represents this and this. It's very much like the first chapter of the Diamond Sutra, where the Buddha just sits down, takes off his robes, and sets down his bowl. And that is enlightenment. Just the very function, just sitting here, touching the earth. And Buddha is said to have gone on and lived until he was about 80 or 81 years old, somewhere in there, and had quite a prolific life of teaching. But I guess I'd like to come back to those 4 signs. Birth, old age, sickness, and death, or just old age, sickness, death, and peace. And how often we get seduced back into those. And so I just came out of a 10-day solitary retreat. And so I did my flip-flop. While I was in retreat, I had talked to SokukoJi and decided, okay, I'm going to eat once a day. Just see what that's like. So asceticism, eat 1 meal a day. And it worked. It was very nice. It was like, this is workable and I can sit. And then the first day I came out, Rumi had graduated preschool, so I had loaded cheesy fries, a cheeseburger, onion rings, 2 beers, and an ice cream cone. I did it backwards. I did asceticism, then sense pleasures. And something that didn't come up as a realization, but some insight into my practice is these little trips we go on. That's what Trungpa Rinpoche called them, trips. Like you're on a spiritual trip. And that was from a transcript Sokusan had me reading while I was in retreat. And it's trying to take these little parts of our lives and turn them into like these big spiritual turning points. Like maybe if I don't eat very much for 10 days, I'll have a more profound practice. Or maybe if I meditate 12 hours instead of 10 hours a day. And it's that little mind that's trying to pull us back into sickness, aging, and death. It's trying to take the phenomenal world and draw some sort of meaning out of it that will give us lasting satisfaction. So drawing meaning out of sense pleasure, drawing meaning out of profound spiritual states of mind, drawing meaning out of self-mortification and austerities, and a complete unwillingness to be bored. To just say, so then I'd like to go on a retreat for 10 days. Okay, go ahead and do that. And just be bored. But try to look for meaning. That's what I noticed. That's what I came out of that retreat with, is trying to understand how we're trying to manipulate sickness, old age, and death to give our lives a type of meaning that we can't maintain. Doesn't mean we don't enjoy the fig while we're in the palace, or that there aren't times where we might do with less, or that there aren't times where our meditation practice naturally shows up into somewhat of a state that's quite pleasant. But our spiritual path is not confined to momentariness, like the momentariness of fasting for 10 days, or the momentariness of being in retreat, or the momentariness of X, Y, and Z happening. But it's our willingness to be disappointed by seeing the moment by moment offering, which is our path and practice. And so the Buddha story is, I think, a great one. It may not have happened in that way. It may not have happened at all, but we can all look at our life. We all started out like Gautama in some way. Like we were taught that the most important things are to have stability in your job and your finances and your relationships, and everything will protect you. And we were not able to maintain that facade. So we come into spirituality, and most of us, not all of us, our first approach is trying to pursue spiritual experiences. Maybe it wasn't right into asceticism, but trying to pursue spiritual experiences that will combat the mundanity. 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 Danica Patrick, wasn't she in Chris President? But we look for spirituality that gives us an experience that makes us feel satisfied or fulfilled. And I think that a lot of us come to SokukoJi, to SokukoJi, after really having to exhaust so much, because we don't want it to be having to getting used to being bored, which is a lot of what meditation is. I mean, there's waves, and it's almost like the terrible times can be very seductive because at least something's happening. It's that time where we're just sitting here where it's like, it's this, just sitting here. And so the Buddha's life emulates that. It's indulgence, spiritual practice, asceticism, and then the middle way. Taking what he needed into his body, making a comfortable seat out of kusa grass. He sat on something comfortable instead of like a porcupine or cactus, tiger. And he just sat there. And then he touched the earth. And I don't know that this leads to maybe the more profound versions of liberation that are sometimes promoted or proselytized in Buddhism, but I think if I could at the very least have a willingness to lead a simple life, not simple in the reduction of stimulation, but simple in the sense that each relationship as it arises is simple and that it's direct. Not something I can claim at this point, probably ever. But the simplicity of having a direct relationship to life as it arises, a direct relationship to Mara tempting you with demons, a simple relationship to Mara undermining your identity, a simple relationship to Mara tempting you with sense pleasures. And so the pragmatism, the reality, the intimacy and immediacy that the practice can arise as is not always satisfying, but there is some sort of relief that we can just at least have an intention to relax into the simplicity of directness, of what is arising. Any questions? Sure.
Shuttle bowing. In the practice become, I guess I'm looking at it, there's like the asceticism and hedonism, and then looking at pragmatism, I guess would be idealism. What would be the middle way between, or what would that be?
To me, the middle way is at no point a prescribed activity. Even within the context of our community, if you were to look at asceticism in a literal sense, all of us are practicing varying degrees. Some people who live here have very austere relationships to their life, and it's natural. There's nothing forced, there's nothing contrived. It's not an attempt to live something more profound than others. And others of us indulge more, like eating all that food. There's some people that just wouldn't do that here. Having a TV or listening to my music. So similarly between pragmatism and what was the other one you said?
Idealism.
Idealism. I don't know. I do feel that something that I notice over time is that the pragmatism is an early part of the practice, and you can't maintain it because the practice in a logical sense can't maintain pragmatism because the self-centeredness can't disseminate this to its end. So I think it has pragmatic beginnings. We practice meditation because we're suffering. It allows us to see more clearly our self-deception. It gives a very strong container to work with a mind that can be very unruly. But as we go into that, it becomes more and more unreasonable. And the pragmatism becomes weaker in a traditional sense because we can't justify the way the path is always unfolding. So it's situational. And it seems like it will modify just intensely as our practice and path evolves.
Shuttle bowing. You had brought up, I think, in the 19th century, it kind of got whitewashed. Is that something you're seeing now with science kind of appreciating Buddhism as a religion, like being too practical with it?
What I notice is both ends of it. There's almost a defensiveness amongst practitioners sometimes where we actually want to fight with that instead of seeing that that may be their entry point and that it may actually be helping by bringing attention to meditation. Is science going to be able to unravel enlightenment? It doesn't look that way to me. But I also am very tentative to create another enemy of, like, oh, they're ruining it, instead of seeing that that's pretty neat. It's pretty interesting that on a wider level, people are trying to look at this. They're trying to understand that. And that we have an opportunity to interface with people around that may come to meditation because they read about it in Time magazine, or they saw it on Johns Hopkins website, or the Dalai Lama is all about science. He has a science and life conference every year at Dharamsala. Yeah.
One last question. With you were calling the things that the Buddha saw, was it birth, sickness, aging, and death?
Old age, sickness, and death. Or sickness, old age, and death.
Do those correlate to the, like, looking at it as suffering, impermanence, and no self? Are those like the same teaching?
I've heard that there's a way to bring those together, that the other three marks of existence would be dukkha, anicca, and anatta, which suffering, impermanence, and no self. Suffering is sickness. Sickness is the pain of pain. And it can be the pain of alternation because we miss when we were healthy and we look forward to it. Having trouble keeping thoughts together. So you have suffering, you have impermanence, old age. It's very much an aspect of impermanence we can't maintain no matter how many creams we put on, no matter how many superfoods we eat. We can delay it perhaps. And death is the final physical representation that this was not real. This is not a substantial, valid, eternal vehicle for our consciousness. So yes, you could, I like that about Buddhism. If you're creative enough, you can kind of bring any of those concepts together. I'm not always so creative. Further questions? Is my voice volume okay?
玉红报应.
Go ahead, you.
So the story you just said to us is, to me, is very extreme, and for me, to not setting standards for myself to practice, even though I want to be a student of a teacher who is so serious on this path. What's the attitude of hearing Buddhist teaching, this story?
The attitude of hearing it?
Yeah.
It doesn't have, I don't think it has to be anything special. It may very much be that that is a distasteful story for some. I'm not saying that's the case for you, but there's no need to have a special way of relating to it. I think just like you would listen to anything else, just curiosity and noticing the preferences of liking or disliking that arise around that. So just similar attitude of just receiving, noticing.
You help me shower?
If he asked me to shower him. 玉红报应. But this is a classic story, and somehow this is very inspiring. At the same time, to hear that is very frustrating for me, is trying to learn from the story, try to follow, this great master or the great teacher, at the same time not setting standards for myself, because at the time lots of things are different. That's why my question arose, how just to receive the story. But you said that already. Bye.
And you can notice the little bit of disappointment of the standard you set up of like, oh, I want to practice like the Buddha, but you come back to the teacher and ask for feedback on your practice. You come back to the teacher and have some sense that the teacher will give you the direction you need. And the Buddha is not the only example. The Buddha is great because we should acknowledge that somebody at some point in time had a profound enough realization that it was able to ripple into 2,500 years of religion. But again, the text I was studying by Trungpa Rinpoche, he was just talking about or acknowledging how, particularly in the Kagyu lineage, there's so many different wonderful examples of Mahasiddhas and Panditas that we can follow. And the three examples he gave were Marpa, who was wealthy and was married and had a son and drank beer, and yet was the holder of this profound 6 yogas teaching. And then he transmitted it, his student. So you have sensory pleasure, transmits it to Milarepa, who is an extreme ascetic, extreme to the point of emaciation. He's only drinking metal tea. His skin turns green. They think he's a monster or a demon. And then his transmission was to Gampopa. And Gampopa was a monastic. So you have a lay practitioner who holds the highest teachings. You have an ascetic yogi who receives those teachings. And then you have a traditional classical monk who's following the Vinaya, living in a monastery that receives these teachings. So that just goes to show our realization is not dependent upon a lifestyle. It is a recognition that is available in the lay homekeeper. It is available in the yogi. It is available in the monastic. But we don't have to get caught up in this image of what a great teacher would be like. And I think that that's part of what draws people here, is that it makes these teachings accessible for those of us that still have to engage in the world heavily. Don't have that opportunity to just recede into the mountains. I was reflecting on that while I was in retreat. Brought up before, I have this strange connection to Dogo Khyentse Rinpoche, who was kind of the epitome of a Tibetan master. He was a homekeeper. He had a wife. He was not a monk. But I was just thinking, I have this connection. I don't know that I could have been a student of his, because his students practiced so intensively in such a classical setting. So that's what's brought most of us here, is that these teachings are being tailored to work for us, not work for us, but work in the context of the very life that we're leading. We're not being asked to make dramatic modifications. A little bit, like carve out time for meditation. No,
Did you say you were bored in your 10-day solitary retreat?
sometimes.
How does boredom help us on the path?
I wish I could be more appreciative of the boredom, because I feel that there's so much richness that's involved in the impulse to entertain ourselves. If you're not bored, you're not having to look at the impulse to cover up. And that, I was thinking about my early solitary retreats upstairs in Milarepa and wondering maybe I should do some of that again, because out at Black Stag, walked a couple of times a day. And I told you about all the wildlife I saw, how cool that was. There was a possum carrying around babies, and there was bullfrogs, and there were snakes and deer, and like a Disney film. The boredom is only boredom because there's some sense that we're lacking something, that something needs to be happening. Otherwise, what really is boredom? It's an acknowledgement that you're not doing much, sitting there. So boredom's a wonderful opportunity, and it's not the only opportunity. It's not like when things are fiery that there's not an equal opportunity to look at that, or when things are very pleasant that there's not an equal opportunity to look at it. But boredom's the most underappreciated because it's the easiest to get rid of. It's easiest to cover up. It's the easiest because of the nature of our culture and society. That's what capitalism is. It's selling us our happiness. Products and activities and services and input and stimulation. It's like we're being sold from day one that boredom's the enemy and we have the solution if you've got enough money. Pogo stick.
Were you happy in your 10-day solitary retreat?
Not this time. I have been. My first retreat at Shugyewan was just this bizarre, like living on a cloud. My body felt amazing. Just sitting just 4 hours in the morning, 3 in the afternoon, 3 at night, hardly moving at all. Air was fresh, crisp at night, and I was happy. It was weird. This time, I wouldn't particularly describe it as happy.
So is that the second noble truth that we're engaged in when we're not happy?
No, the second noble truth is not really anything in particular. When you're not happy, it's just not happy. It's all the mechanisms that come together to say that shouldn't be the case or strategize our way out of it. That's the second noble truth to me. Being unhappy is, again, coming back to Trungpa Rinpoche, just talks about those things as energies. And it's hard to see them like that because it's so hard to distinguish the energy from the story, which is dissatisfaction and how to remedy that. But I think unhappiness in and of itself is not the second noble truth. It has to do with how everything comes together to make a demand and motivate action or trick us or seduce us into trying to rectify the difficulty.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sure.
Sure, bowing. By seeing that unhappiness, does it help to reveal some confusion that we have about what happiness is?
In a relative sense, it may, but anything that's revealed is still an aspect of relative truth. It's still an aspect of the path. It's still something I said to SokukoJi in my exit interview based on something that happened in my retreat is recognizing that confusion is recognizing confusion. So any insight I have is an aspect, perhaps a more refined or logical or intelligent aspect of confusion, recognizing what it perceives as a more coarse or defiled form of confusion. So if you're distinguishing it, if you're differentiating it, it can be helpful. It can help soften our relationship to the world, but there's still an aspect of identity that we're endeavoring to look at that hasn't clarified. Any other questions? SokukoJi?
So, in the teachings of the Buddha and the history of the Buddha that you've been looking at in order to do this, is there something in the life of the Buddha that is inspiring to you or helps you by reflecting on it or thinking about it? Even the ones that are not really sure what actually happened, of course. Anything there?
Something I've always found very sometimes emotional, and I can't really say why, it's just that gesture of touching the earth. To me, that is Zen. He did not explain to Mara. He did not provide 25,000 volumes to Mara. He simply touched the earth. So that I would say is the most impactful thing that shows up for me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jishin?
Jishin Bowing. What is happiness? Bowing.
Well, in a relative sense, it's when we're able to insulate ourselves from negativity or dissatisfaction. So in a relative sense, it's a state of mind where we are enjoying the things that are around us. I don't know in the ultimate sense. When we talk about it, I think about like a complete transparency or complete fluidity, complete simplicity of causes and conditions coming together and dissipating. But even that would fall short because we're talking about it. So I guess I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but that's what shows up.
Thank you.
Is there a final question this evening?
I'd like to start by thanking you for being here. As SokukoJi often does, just let you know that we really appreciate all the support you show through your contributions and your participation. There's a great deal, and I mean a great deal, that goes into keeping this functioning, operating, up and running, just being able to continue to make these teachings available, let alone the maintenance of the building. So anything you can offer is always greatly received and appreciated. And again, if nothing else, your greatest gift is your participation in these teachings and practices.